Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the last lecture of this course, which is on Prokofiev's opera War and Peace. So how do you set War and Peace to music? Have you read War and Peace? Raise your hands. How many of you have read every single word of War and Peace? Okay. Because I cannot actually say this about myself. I read it several times, but I cannot vouch for not missing out some passages. You may know this story, that this rumor that the title of this novel should actually be translated War and Society because of that different spelling that appears in some publications, in some of the editions. Well, it's actually just a misprint, yeah, so there is no reason to suspect that. It is War and Peace. And it is about the events of the Napoleonic Wars, 1805 to 1812. Tolstoy's novel was written in the 60s, Prokofiev's opera in between 1941 and 1953. So you can see that Tolstoy is separated from the events by about 50 years, Prokofiev's opera from Tolstoy by about, 70 years. Am I counting correctly? Yes, and we are also separated from Prokofiev by about the same number of years. So we have this progressive changing of meaning, and yet sort of keep coming back to that very important moment when Russia faced Napoleon. So 559 characters in Tolstoy's novel. You couldn't put them all on stage, obviously, but Prokofiev still puts on quite a lot, 70. They have to double up some of the singers, to make it more economical. It's still hugely expensive to put on. And of course, you know from other fun facts about about Tolstoy's novel that it has very long sentences. The language is quite weighty and convoluted and has lots of twists and turns. So 220 words in the longest sentence. If you read it to the end, you will know that it ends with this essay on the philosophy of history, which actually has bullet points in it. It's almost like, I don't know, an undergraduate or postgraduate essay. It just completely changes genre towards the end. So it is a very strange thing, and Tolstoy himself disputed that it was a novel. It was in its own genre. It's a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. It's possibly the most colorful history of that period as well, as being a very involving drama. So Prokofiev, you can see him conducting here about the right age of when he started thinking about writing this opera. So it was his own idea. He loved this work. And I think he was also fascinated by the idea of this challenge. He liked the challenge, and he loved setting the most awkward prose to music. By that stage, he was already back in the Soviet Union. He had spent 15 years abroad, built a career in Paris. He wrote for Diaghilev. Now he was back, and he had to find a way to become a Soviet composer, which wasn't very easy. And although he had some great successes on that wave, as for example his film Alexander Nevsky, which he did with Eisenstein, and which was extremely patriotic and became extremely important during the war. Nevertheless, he was still viewed with suspicion as someone who hasn't quite unpacked his suitcases. This is the phrase that they actually used about him. And Alexander Nevsky, for example, everyone got a Stalin Prize for it, but Prokofiev didn't. So his music was kind of, it was ignored. His contribution was ignored at that point. He also had other setbacks. He wrote a huge cantata for the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution. I'll play you a little fragment from it later, which wasn't performed. It was found that you could not set to music the words of Lenin or even Marx and Engels, or Stalin. Yeah, in fact, it was a transgression, so they couldn't perform it in 1937. And it was a huge work, so that was a huge blow for him. So, it was going up and down, and then in 1939 he wrote a cantata for Stalin's birthday, 60th birthday, which is called Zdravitsa, and that was a success, So he was up and down, but his position as a Soviet composer was not yet assured. These are wonderful bits of film that we can have. When he plays a waltz from the opera War and Peace, himself on the piano talks a little bit about it.
Сергей Сергеевич, может быть, вы расскажете нашим зрителям о вашей работе?
Ну что же, я сейчас работаю над симфонической свитой вальсов, в которой войдет 3 вальса из «Золушки», 2 вальса из «Войны и мир» и 1 вальс из фильма «Лермонтов». Сейчас с большим блеском поставили в Ленинграде.
So it's wonderful to see him, although there is no charisma at all, I think, coming from him at that point. Yes, but it's just funny how stiff he looks on camera and how artificial the whole situation is. But it's wonderful to have a little bit of this, nevertheless. So he was he's pictured here in his country house, which cost him a huge amount of money, nearly bankrupted him. And this is his second wife, Mira Mendelssohn. And in fact, she's a very important person in facilitating his work on War and Peace. Because she was a student when he met her. Yeah, he left his first wife, and it was quite acrimonious. She was 25 years his younger, so I'm sure he imagined himself as a bit of an André Balkonsky versus Natasha Rostova there, somebody who's really sort of suddenly sees a new spring and renewal in this wonderful girl, and Mira Mendelssohn, because she was a literary student and she was a bit of a poet herself and a writer, so she helped him with the libretto. She read War and Peace to him, so it's very much connected with her, this project. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Prokofiev's interest in setting prose and give you a few examples from earlier on. Because literally one of the first big things that he wrote, which is not very big, it's a big song, or it's a mini mono-opera, which is called The Ugly Duckling, yeah, which is based on the prose of Anderson in Russian translation. And this is what you have there. Being told in this arioso recitative, and the orchestra illustrating what is going on. Yeah, that is very much Prokofiev's style. That's how he starts. Adventurous setting of prose, and I already mentioned it was in the cantata for the 20th anniversary of October, yeah, where he said parts of the Communist Manifesto and also speeches of Lenin. So I'll give you a little bit of that. it sounds incredibly fun, and that was part of the reason why it wasn't performed, because he couldn't actually, agree. You can't allow this kind of fun to be happening to Lenin's text, because it is, it's hard to know, of course, when you don't know Russian, but there's something, the frisson that you have, when you hear these words, very stodgy, very official words, suddenly sung to a tune, and sometimes the tune is beautiful as well. Or Stalin's words being sung by a female choir. Why by a female choir? So there's lots of questions. But give Prokofiev a 5-syllable word, a 6-syllable word, he would love to set it, like proletariata, the proletariat. So it sounds absolutely wonderful in that cantata. So I think the challenge of setting Tolstoy's words also has to do with that, not just with his love for the characters, for the psychology, for everything that we know, but actually the actual musical challenge of setting these texts. So in April 1941, so during the World War II, but before the Nazi invasion of Russia, so Russia was still at peace at that point, he writes a scenario in 11 scenes, and then everything changes when Germany invades the USSR. That spurs him on. He starts writing it very quickly, and in the space of several months, he finishes the first version in vocal score, so not orchestrated yet. And then 2 officials, the Minister of Culture, Hrabchenko, and a musicologist who is kind of his assistant, acting as his assistant, visit Tbilisi, where Prokofiev is in evacuation. Remember that during the war he was in several places, far outside Moscow and Leningrad. And they hear this, still unfinished scenes. He plays them on the piano. So he begins orchestration, and he's already aware of the necessity for revisions. He actually writes a letter to them saying, I want to move this opera forward, I'm prepared for revisions. So they must have told him something straight away about things that they liked and disliked. So Sviatoslav Richter, the famous pianist, and another very good pianist, Vedernikov, play the opera to the ministry on the 12th of May 1942. In its first version, 4 hands on the piano. This is how it used to be auditioned. That was the way to audition it. So, Prokofiev, of course, is not there. He is very far away, and he is awaiting the news with great anxiety. What will be the reaction to this audition? And the letters, the 2 letters which arrive together, one written out before the other, but they arrive in the same envelope in mid-July. And this letter, letters from Hrabchenko and from Schlieffstein, enumerate various changes that they want him to do. And then he starts the process of revision. Let us start with the first version. So this process of revision, as you may know, took more than 10 years and basically never finished because Prokofiev died. So he could never please them enough. But let us see what he started with. Let us see what the actual first version was before any changes. So the opera was already in 11 scenes, so already quite big, and it was in this very distinct 2 parts, peace and war. So, and the first 6 scenes were the peaceful ones, and they were very coherently outlining the story of Natasha's love for Andrei Balkonsky, or Andrei Balkonsky's love for Natasha, and how it all unraveled. The interesting thing here is that Prokofiev was not trying to present a completely coherent story, because he could rely on your knowledge of the novel. Every single person in the Soviet Union was supposed to have studied it at some point. So you could rely on that you would know the plot. So he could omit some very crucial scenes. So if you see in the first scene, for example, he's presenting André and Natasha, and they don't yet meet in that scene. André overhears Natasha wanting to fly, and he's very excited about this lively voice, this lively presence, and falls in love with her without actually meeting her. And then the moment of the meeting is not shown. And the next scene is already Natasha being humiliated by her prospective father-in-law. So the engagement is already on, but Andrei Balkonsky's father doesn't want this marriage to happen, so he sends Andrei away for a year. For a year. She's a teenager. That's the first thing that's happened to her. He sends him away for a year. There is no Skype. There's maybe a letter a month. I mean, so he knows what he's doing. He wants to break them up. And that's exactly what happens. Yeah, and she realizes also that they don't want her. She is extremely hurt by that. And then this rogue Anatole, confesses his love to her and says, "I'm going to die, if you're not going to respond." And so she responds and prepares to elope with him. Thankfully, it's all broken up by her cousin. The elopement fails. She tries to commit suicide, and she's extremely ashamed of what she has done because she realizes she's fallen for the wrong guy because Anatole already was married once. Yeah, so she would essentially marry a bigamist. So this is all very tragic, and then Pierre Bezukhov, who will eventually become Natasha's husband, sort of saves the situation. He sends Anatole away, and at that moment, war is declared, end of peace. So, and then you have the second part, which is war, and that's another 5 scenes. A very important scene is scene 10, when Natasha and André meet again. Yeah, but and she can actually ask for forgiveness, and he's completely forgiven her by that stage, and their love is sparked again, but at that point he dies because he's been gravely wounded in the war. And all the rest, are these huge scenes with lots of characters. Some of them are battle scenes, yeah, like the one with Napoleon. Some of them just have this enormous number of different groups coming and going, like the scene in Moscow, which is devastated and then starts burning, and so on. So it's like as if we're in a different opera. Yeah, everything was very lyrical and intimate and chamber-like in the first part, and then suddenly it opens up to this huge scale of a historical scale, and with huge masses of people involved. So to give you an idea of how Prokofiev structures his piece scenes and what he does there, we will just hear the very beginning. So not the overture, but the beginning of the first scene. And the interesting thing here is that if you listen, it starts with a lyrical melody. It's a very Prokofiev-like melody. Prokofiev's melodies are always very different from anyone else. You will always recognize him because they're always slightly strange. They have these very wide leaps, very wide intervals, and at the same time they have very tight sometimes moves, these chromatic, sort of very romantic and lyrical moments in them. Yeah, so they are strange, and yet they're also a little bit traditional. Yeah, so it's still a beautiful melody, and if you manage to memorize it eventually, yeah, it will stay with you in your head for days. Yeah, like an earworm. But it takes some time to get memorized, so to speak. Yeah, so some of these melodies, and you will see how Prince André is singing this melody. It's actually Natasha's melody, but he sings it first because all these leitmotifs, or light melodies that Prokofiev has in this opera, they don't actually belong to the characters. Yeah, they belong to the author. He's a bit like Tolstoy, yeah, who gets into the mind of everyone, and he tells you what Natasha was thinking, and even what André was dreaming, and even the substance of his delirium. Yeah, he's completely omniscient narrator. Yeah, as far as you can go with that. So Prokofiev, in that sense, he holds all these themes for himself. They're all authorial. He can give a Russian theme for the French to sing, just because they admire Russian courage. Yeah, so it's not like they've overheard it. It's because he gives it to them, yeah, by the power of his omniscience. So that's how they work. And so this Natasha's theme, you will hear that when he sings it, there are actually quite a lot of syllables on one note. it's like «так всё зазеленело, зазеленело». It's like monotone, yeah, which means that he took this huge word, зазеленело, which is becoming green, yeah, so 5 syllables, and stuck it into a melody that was already there. Yeah, that's not what you're supposed to do. It's not very good writing, yeah, not very good setting of prose, but it's a very Prokofiev thing to do. So that's one type of dealing with the text. When you've written the melody first, and then the melody will be repeated with different words, yeah, so they won't always necessarily fit. There's some kind of awkwardness about it, and yet there is something also very endearing about it. Well, I'm a big fan of Prokofiev, so I'm very biased. Yeah, but anyway, so let's hear this beginning. Scene comes from a passage in Tolstoy's novel. I'm not going to read it all, but I'll just put it on to illustrate how Prokofiev is trying to get some phrases of Tolstoy. Obviously, you can't say a whole sentence like that, yeah, but phrases that will remind you of that particular page of the novel. So this is Prince André, yeah, he just lost his first wife. One stage of his life is over. He is depressed. He feels his life will never be fun again. Yeah, and then he associates him with this oak tree. Yeah, so everything around is already green, and the oak tree has these gnarly, whatever, twigs, whatever. So he thinks, well, I'm like this oak tree. And then suddenly, yeah, he sees this oak tree again, and it's sprouted as well. Yeah, so through the hard century-old bark, even where there were no twigs, leaves are sprouted such as one could hardly believe the old veteran could have produced. Yes, it is the same oak, thought Prince Andrew, and all at once he was seized by an unreasoning springtime feeling of joy and renewal. At the best, all the best moments of his life suddenly rose to memory, and one of them is that girl thrilled by the beauty of the night. So he associates Natasha with this feeling of spring renewal. So that passage is sort of put into this arioso through a couple of sentences, but he still tries to keep some of Tolstoy's own words, yeah, as Russian composers always tried to do. Mussorgsky did the same with Boris Godunov, trying to keep as much Pushkin as possible. And the same thing happens here. Now, there's also a different type of setting of speech, yeah, and that is a very direct one. Again, the same way as Mussorgsky was trying to do, trying to catch the intonation, try to catch how these words are pronounced. Yeah, so one type were these melodies, yeah, where the text fits awkwardly and strangely, and another type when it fits very naturally. So, for example, when Natasha says, "Sonia, Sonia, how can you sleep? Such a wonderful night."
Sonia, Sonia,
and when she says, "Ну как же можно спать?" Or, how can you sleep? How can you possibly sleep? And the orchestra helps to do this intonation with that chord, which just sounds like reproach. Yeah, it's sort of it's not just in the vocal line. The orchestra helps you to create this sense that this is a very precise psychological aiming, yeah, at that particular phrase. So there are lots of wonderful moments like this, but you just have to trust me, yeah, because I know Russian. So, but there's something else that Prokofiev does also. You know how Tolstoy, he liked describing his characters at length. Yeah, so there's a long description. And then when the character comes again, he will use a couple of phrases like a leitmotif, And so it's the same character comes with the same description, so to speak. Sometimes they can be quite sickening eventually, yeah, like André's first wife, he keeps talking about her upper lip and her little mustache, and every time she appears, she mentions his mustache, and you think, oh God, he's just misogynist, and has something against her. It sort of becomes a little bit strange. But so what Prokofiev does, he doesn't quite do the same thing. He has leitmotifs, but as I said, they don't quite belong to the characters. But what he does, he can produce a little fragment, musical fragment, which may never be repeated, but it gives you a very concise portrayal of that person. And what it is, it's hard to say. It's the way they speak, or maybe it's the way they move. It's very gestural music. You can sort of imagine the liveliness of Natasha when she says that she is going to fly. I'm going to play you that little passage. Yeah, so everything, the orchestration, this little sort of jumping rhythm is portraying Natasha's, how she moves, what she is like. So you don't need to write a 220-word sentence to do that. Yeah, you can do that in this tiny piece of music. Sometimes there are these incredibly, again, precise psychological moments. Natasha, for example, when she is longing for André, she's in the house of her father. She feels extremely alienated. Yeah, they're not accepting her. He does a very rude thing. He appears in his dressing gown, although she knows that she's come just to humiliate her. And she has this idea fix, oh, I just want to see him, everything would be fine if I could only see him, if I could only look into his eyes and he would look into mine. Yet she's so young, she doesn't yet know, this love hasn't yet had a chance to develop. And so that is her hope, maybe he's already here and I've forgotten. Yeah, and this is a wonderful chromatic melody. It really is a romantic melody of longing. It comes back several times, just when she's trying to keep, holding to that thought like an anchor, but it all fails. And why, you will see. I'll show you another little portrait. Yeah, so that's of the old Balkonsky when he comes out in this dressing gown. And even before he comes out, yeah, the orchestra tells you that something odious is going to happen. Yeah, the orchestra. And he is addressing her in this very sarcastic way, and there's this very cutting sounds in the orchestra, producing this sharpness and almost hurting Natasha, sort of physically.
Я не ошибаюсь, прошу простить, не знал, сударыня, вот видит Бог, не знал, что вы удостоили нас своим посещением.
Yeah, so you don't need anything else, you have the whole portrait in that little tiny passage, even though it may never be repeated. So this is what happens in these peace scenes. So what about the war scenes, and how are they acting in that original version? I must say that we're very lucky to have the original version now on video, which is semi-staged, and that was the initiative between Glasgow and Rostov. Yeah, so two countries, young people coming together. So they're all going to be very young, you will see, even those who are supposed to be old. But it allows us to hear the opera as it was conceived. So basically, what you have in the war scenes is a similar approach. You just have lots of characters, so it becomes like kaleidoscopic change all the time. Yeah, you go from one to another, different characters, because the war for Tolstoy is, or history generally, is not moved by several great people. It is moved by these myriad of random happenings and random people, yeah, so contributing something to the development of events. This is his philosophy of history. It's a very Tolstoyan thing to build this mass of people from little tiny portraits, yeah, and Tolstoy is very good at characterizing them, and so is Prokofiev. So you just move from one to another, and they all have these little phrases or little ways of speaking, or little arioso passages, a little bit like in the peace scene, so only it's all multiplied. But there's another new element of that, and that is folk-like music. So he took a couple of folk texts from the time and put them to his own music, but in the style of these soldier songs. Yeah, so that gives a very different coloring to these scenes. So you will hear one of them.
Пришел народу наш Кутузов, как взывал народ он бить французов, звал народ побить французов, кричит русском бой своих сынов, близок сердцу материнский зов. Поспешил на клич народ из осенних домов, из лесов отвечал, из-за дальнего моря. Жизни нашей не щадя мы пойдем, и в боях железные полки мы сомнем. Всюду черный свет врагов, повсюду горе ближним, делом черном кровь и гар.
Yeah, so this very daring song, which really sounds like something they might have sung, but it's Prokofiev's music. And it's a funny rhyme there, which comes from the folk text. Yeah, Kutuzov, which is Field Marshal Kutuzov, who is the Russian commander. Franzuzov, yeah, which is the French, we're going to beat the French. Kutuzov rhymes with Franzuzov, so it is funny as well. The interesting thing is how Kutuzov is portrayed, yeah, because also in Tolstoy's novel, he is not presented as a great leader, yeah, like Napoleon. Napoleon is supposed to be this very grand leader, or that's what he thinks of himself, yeah. And Kutuzov is sort of one of the people, and at first they don't know how he can possibly win anything, yeah, because he's old and decrepit already. You know, he's only got one eye, and his decisions are a bit strange, and he doesn't exude power in the way that they expect of him. And so it's a kind of slightly counterintuitive that he becomes the commander of the Russian army and leads it eventually to victory. And of course, the most controversial decision that he took is to leave Moscow, yeah, to the French. And that was a decision that he took because he wanted to save the army. You know, because he thought, you know, if we're going to lose the army while trying to defend Moscow, we are going to lose the war. So, because Kutuzov is one of the people, he is also engaged in this banter, you know, with ordinary soldiers, and Prokofiev is not trying to put him on a pedestal in this first version. So, well, this is a young Kutuzov, yeah, from the original production, but he's very good bass. Yeah, so what I was going to play you is the ending of the opera. It's how the original version was supposed to have ended. So he thanks everyone for good service, and then he starts joking, and you can hear them laughing. Huge apotheosis. They're not singing for half an hour hymns or anything, you know, anthems, yeah, which was, of course, a huge problem, yeah, with the first version. So one of the things you will see they kept demanding of him is this: write us an apotheosis. He wrote one, that wasn't good enough. He wrote another one. Yeah, so eventually, well, this is from the Bolshoi production, so it's not very good video. It's a different music altogether. It's much more hymnic. It's much more massive and it's much longer. I just don't have time to play the whole thing, yeah, but it's much, much longer. So who were these two people, who essentially became collaborators on the opera? So Hrabchenko, as I said, was Minister of Culture, or chair of the Committee for Arts Affairs, as he was called at the time, so he's on the left. He also happened to be a Tolstoy scholar, so he felt he really had something to say here. And another one was a professional musicologist. This is a much older picture of him. That's the only one I could find, who was a senior consultant, to the ministry, who actually really told Prokofiev in great detail of what he needed to do to revise his opera. So let's go back to the chronology. So after this audition, they decided that they will stage the opera at the Bolshoi if Prokofiev does these revisions. So he received these letters. The letter from Hrabchenko says that the lyrical scenes were mainly successful, but had serious doubts about the war scenes, that the general tone was wrong. So it was a very strict comment here. There's no organic connection between these scenes. There are too many petty details. I was telling you that was coming from Tolstoy's philosophy of history, but that doesn't matter. That's not how he understood Tolstoy. So it was a bad idea to begin with a lyrical intimate scene. So Prokofiev actually devised a choral epigraph to go in front of it. So the opera needs to be seriously reworked. And Schlieffstein's letter, so the musicologist's letter, actually went into much further detail. And if you get the transcript, I actually give you most of that letter in translation, so you can enjoy it at leisure. So he says that Natasha and André are very good, their music is truly poetic, but Pierre is less satisfactory. Actually, when you think of that, he is right. Pierre, whom Natasha is going to end up with as a husband, is not as vivid a character as André or Natasha. There are too many conversations, too many irrelevant details. Well, of course, cut all the Masonic thoughts of Pierre, because he's not supposed to be a Mason in the Soviet version of War and Peace. So these repeated syllables in the chorus, I will show you that scene, that's supposed to be like the sounds of in André's mind during the delirium scene. That is ridiculous. Cut it out, he says. But war scenes, many more comments. The good beginning, that's all good, but too many conversations. Russian simple people are represented as colorful but simpletons. Where is this wonderful people that Kutuzov is talking about? Let's show the unity of the Russian people. There's a good theme sung by André, but that can be used as a victory theme. He gives you precise musical advice of what to do with a particular theme. We have never had this before, this kind of interference in the Soviet Union. There were lots of interference in Soviet operas, but not ever to this amount of detail, this amount of precision. Scene 9, Moscow, is no good, except 3 moments. So he actually suggests including a procession of Napoleon, which is not even in Tolstoy, but he says, well, there is this Soviet historian who wrote a book on Napoleon. It's called Evgeny Tarle, and you can take it from there. So it points him what to do, and demands to have a big symphonic development there, which is exactly what Prokofiev does. I hope to play you that. Scene 11 should not be just the tying of loose ends. The Alexander Nevsky-like music is needed. What he does at the end, which you've just heard in the apotheosis, is exactly Alexander Nevsky-like music. So he follows this advice very precisely, and so on. So it has to be thoroughly reworked. So eventually, over the years, because of the war, the production didn't happen. He started making more and more changes, and the most important changes is that there are 2 new scenes. There are lots of changes in the war scenes, which I'm not going to detail. But the main things, actually, there's a new scene in the peace part as well, and there's a new scene in the war part. And this new scene in the peace part, where Natasha and André actually meet and dance their waltz together, that was the advice of the conductor who was supposed to stage that opera, Samuil Samasud. And he actually staged the first part. That was the premiere of the peace scenes under him. So, and you will see how the opera is being transformed into something else by the introduction of that scene, because that scene introduces almost a kind of pastiche of Eugene Onegin. Yeah, it's a ball scene. There are different dances, waltzes, mazurkas, conversations happen there. The music is pastiche music. It's not as modern as in the rest of the opera. It tries to pretend to be 19th century. And because there are of all these set pieces and set numbers, it becomes more like a 19th century opera. So yeah, so something really important happens there. And as for this scene of the military council, this was important because that put on the pedestal Kutuzov. Yeah, because imagine that this was the time when the fact that Russia won the war, the Soviet Union won the war with the Nazis, was completely ascribed to Stalin personally. Yeah, that was his personal achievement. Yeah, the history of the Great Patriotic War was described as 10 Stalin blows. Yeah, they were all his own blows. I mean, now we know that he wasn't any kind of strategist, and in fact never been to the front. And basically just whenever he tried to take some military decision, it was usually a disaster. But nevertheless, that's how it was presented. So Kutuzov was a kind of Stalin. Yeah, they were trying to turn him into the leader, and the leader had to have great rousing music to go with him. So he writes this scene of the military council, which is very much like a scene of Stalin from war films, poring over maps and then saying something very quietly, but very important. Yeah, but also contains this big aria for Kutuzov, because another problem with this opera that, yeah, there were too many conversations and not enough singing, and they wanted proper singing. So, and he was postponing for years writing this aria, and he really was reluctant to go along with this. But nevertheless, he did in the end. He took a theme from his film score for Ivan the Terrible and wrote that aria. And it is actually rather beautiful. But I'll first show you the ball scene, yeah, and this famous waltz, which is the meeting between Natalia and André. Listen to this. So he was definitely inspired by it. I'm not saying that he stole it. He used the same key. Yeah, he used the same key, and it has the same kind of romantic and anxious quality, this waltz. Yeah, it's in the minor, actually. It's not happy at all, and it has these dark undertones. It's a beautiful music, yeah, but written very much as a pastiche music for 19th century. And this is the aria that I was talking about. So the same theme that then appears at the very end. Yeah, it becomes this apotheosis theme. So, and eventually, the last thing he did, actually, the very last thing before he died, he also extended this aria further. He put a middle section in, so it now became an ABA, proper operatic set form. So this is how the opera was changing. Yeah, not just ideologically, but also musically. It was becoming much grander statement with much more singing, with many more set pieces, and far fewer conversations. So another scene that gave a lot of trouble to the critics all the time, they just could not agree with it, was the only scene featuring Napoleon. And I think the problem with that is that Napoleon is not actually presented in a grotesque way or as an evil, as somebody evil. Because what Tolstoy and Prokofiev both do is that there are no completely evil characters. Yeah, they all have their own psychology. They have their own reasons to behave like they do. So they are presented with their own sort of set of circumstances. Although there is arrogance and there is a little bit of wit here in this scene, you know, presenting Napoleon, but he is not a villain. And I think that was really annoying the Soviet officials because they wanted to create a much more greater contrast between good and evil. I'll give you a little bit, a moment of Napoleon having his doubts and how he actually presents a battle scene without showing you the battle. So he's being asked for more reserves, yeah, for more divisions, because they are about to almost lose this battle from Moscow. And you can hear the orders being passed down. And then the trumpet, and then the horses start going. And then he changes his mind, and that's the moment when Napoleon suddenly starts having doubts. No, you know, call this division back. And you have the orders passed down again. You know. It's a great cinematic moment. You don't actually have to see how things happen, but you can imagine it, yeah, in your imagination. So now to this very seminal scene. Why I'm saying seminal, because Prokofiev started writing the opera from it. Yeah, so the meeting between Natasha and André when he's already lying wounded, this chance meeting which turns into this beautiful lyrical scene. Yeah, so again, what I want to show here is how these two aesthetics, one aesthetic of conversational opera, kind of modest, intimate opera, is being intruded by the different aesthetic of a grand opera. So this is his delirium and this invisible chorus. The text is kind of nonsensical because he's just describing what is happening in his delirium. Syllables, nonsensical syllables, have nothing to do with pity. So that is a very powerful scene. And the one thing that is lacks in Tolstoy and also in the original version is lacks sentimentality, because Natasha is kind of that doesn't know what to do. She just wants to ask for forgiveness. And André is being sentimental because he is very sick. You know, he kind of becomes very soft because he is in this very weak position. It's psychologically incredibly well done. And Prokofiev in the original version stays with that. But what he does later, yeah, because they want the opera to be organic, he introduces the reminiscence of the waltz. And really, I hate that moment because I think that destroys this very subtly crafted atmosphere. And it becomes like very crude, sentimental recollection, yeah, of something that happened. I really don't think that it's good there. But maybe we're running out of time, so I'll miss that out. But I'll show you another bit. Oh, no, maybe I will. So at first there's a reminiscence from the very first scene. I really think that doesn't go with the rest. I mean, you might disagree with me. So it tells me, or at some point, in the midst of this delirium, he remembers about motherland and his love for Moscow, and sings Kutuzov's theme, which is also a bit ridiculous. So I think that tells you that Prokofiev was already annoyed with his revisions, and he didn't try to do them very well. In a sense, he just sort of stuck things in what they wanted of him, and the themes show very much. And that is, for me, a problem of this second version. But there is also some of the things are so good in this second. Well, it's not actually the second version; it's the third and the fifth version. Yeah, and let's say that this long version, this symphonic moment in the Moscow scene. Yeah, remember Schliffstein recommending him that he has symphonic development here, and that he introduces this procession of Napoleon who goes and is terrified of this burning city, and that the Russians are supposed to have, started the fires themselves. So he is kind of terrified. It's all gone wrong. He's in Moscow, and yet there is no sense of victory. So listen to this. I'm not going to actually show you any production here. Just listen to the orchestra, what the orchestra is doing. So it's a huge orchestral climax. Yeah, so no matter what you see on stage, it's the music that captures your attention. It's one of my favorite bits in the opera. And so if I were to look into just watching the original version, that will be the bit that I miss more than Kutuzov's aria and the waltz. But the problem is that when the original version was produced by this Glasgow-Rostov collaboration, and people who came to see that were asking, oh, where is Kutuzov's aria? Where is that lovely tune? And where is the waltz? Yeah, so they were missing their favorite bits of the opera. So now we're left with the question. So who was right, yeah, in this conflict? Because, of course, this interference was absolutely sort of atrocious for Prokofiev. Yeah, he was suffering from it. He was always remaining optimistic. He was a great optimist. Yeah, so he remained optimistic at every stage that the opera will be performed and would do everything that was needed. But nevertheless, it was a very tragic period in his life. We don't have time to talk about it, but it was, he was denounced in 1948 again by the state, and then his first wife was taken into the camps. It was it became very ill. It was a hugely tragic period for him as he was trying to do these revisions. And yet, to some extent, yeah, you can say that they got something right. Yeah? And this moment of accessibility, that the music has to be accessible to the large masses of people, we still care about it because we are that wide mass of people. And when we come into the audience, we also want to hear singing, great tunes, and huge emotional climaxes. Thank you very much.